where he also teaches and runs, co-runs the program, the Mundus Masters in journalism, digital journalism. Journalism, Media and Globalization, which is, by the way, open to applications, and it is fully funded for the next 3 years, I think, by the Mundus program, by the EU, basically. So you're encouraged to look that up. We met a couple years ago, right? And I gave a lecture to his class a few weeks ago. Now he's returning the favor as part of our exchange with the Danish School of Media and Journalism and giving a lecture and a workshop. So returning the favor twice. So thank you very much, Professor Steffen.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jad. Actually, it's not always pleasant to return favors, but I think this one really is. I really enjoy being here. It's my first time at LAU, my first time in Beirut, Lebanon, and I really like it. I know it's a place with some problems, of course, but it's great to be here. I'm so happy to be here. So thanks a lot, Jad and Annie and the rest of the team for inviting me and hosting me. Okay, just a few more words maybe about me. I'll keep this very brief because this is not about me, it's about something else. But yeah, I work as a senior associate professor at the Danish School of Media and Journalism and affiliated with this Mundus program, and I really encourage you to look that up. Mundusjournalism.com is the website, and you can check out the different details there, and we do encourage you to apply. But I'm also one of these journalists turned academics. So I have a background in journalism, been a journalist for 15 years, and I still do journalism. Mostly cultural reporting, cultural critique, especially on film and documentary film, but also literature, photography, food. And then I work as a TV host, National Danish TV, where I do a film show. And finally, I'm also involved in some documentary filmmaking as a producer. And by the way, I'm always interested in hearing about ideas and collaboration, so please feel free to reach out to me. I'll provide my contacts at the end of the presentation, and I really love to discuss ideas and open up for collaborations, etc. That's what my life is about, and that's what gives me energy, so please feel free to do that. Yeah. So, a bit of my background, a bit of my research that I'm doing at the moment, and which will sort of feed into the stuff that I'll talk about today. I think basically I'm studying 3 different areas right now. I'm studying digital storytelling, so pretty much looking into how a combination of modalities, text, photo, video, interaction, graphics, data visualization, etc., 360 degrees videos, what have you not, all these digital things, how they can be combined into narratives, how they can be combined into cohesive pieces of journalism. That's one area. Another area is the persona-driven journalism. That's an area where I look into how the personality of the journalist can become part of the journalism itself. So how you can, as a journalist, perform your mediated persona or personality and put that in your stories. Not because you're in love with yourself, but because it actually can give something to the story, add something to the story. And this is what my talk today will be about, how you can do that in video storytelling. And then the third area is the notion of XR technologies, so virtual reality, augmented reality, stuff like that, how that can be used and applied in storytelling and journalism. So that's a project I do with a colleague of mine from Copenhagen, and where we try to also work with students that doesn't have any coding skills, but we try to see if we can create AR and VR journalism without having a large amount of coding skills, because that's an interesting task if that's possible to do. Anyway, I've just provided 2 quotes here that sort of feeds into my approach of journalism studies. Both of the quotes, you can read them if you want. I'm not going to read them aloud, but they speak of the fluidity of journalism, that journalism is not a stable product, it's something that is always ongoing, it's something that is continuously negotiated and renegotiated. And I think that's a very important aspect of my approach to journalism and to the understanding that I have of journalism, that we need to continuously think about what it is and what it can be and should be and could be or shouldn't be, Because there's so much things that surrounds journalism. There's so many things that sort of feels like journalism, but maybe it isn't, or maybe it could be, and it's a big mess often, and often journalism is so fluffy and unstable that it's hard to pin down, but that's part of the attraction, I think. So these quotes speak to this idea of the fluidity and blurring boundaries of journalism. Very briefly on what I want to do today, I want to give some thoughts on how you can apply yourself as a character in your video journalism. So how you can apply this persona-driven approach in different ways to your journalism. I'm going to do that by showing a number of examples. Some of the examples are not necessarily clear-cut as what I want to say, but they resonate somewhat with what I will try to say. You know, sometimes academia and reality doesn't match, right? So sometimes you twist and tweak things. But I'll suggest a typology of how we can think about this character-driven video journalism. And then I'll discuss some reasons to why you maybe should do this, and also reasons that maybe you should stay away from it. Some stories, some topics, some material doesn't fit applying yourself as a character. Other stuff does. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I will also be very interested in hearing your thoughts. And that's actually what I want to sort of start with, just to get you awake again, maybe. So I want to have you consider these questions. And I think the best way to do it, I know you sit a little bit sort of with spaces between you, but just to try to speak to the people. If you're sitting next to one person, then address that person and discuss these topics. And if you're like too far away from a human being, then maybe you should just reflect on your own, just for a few minutes, just like 3 minutes, and then I want to hear some thoughts on this. What is like first-person narratives according to you? Have you ever encountered pieces of journalism where the journalist is a character? And have you maybe even yourself applied yourself in your reporting? I know some of you are journalists. Have you ever done so? What was that experience like? So just give it some thought, speak about it for 3 minutes, and I want to hear what you're thinking. Okay, time is up. Time's up. Sorry, it's only 3 minutes. I know it's very brief, but I have so many videos I want to show you, so we need to get going. Okay, let's hear some thoughts. I know it's sketchy, brief thoughts, draft thoughts, but that has value too. Anyone who wants to raise their voice? Yeah, up here. Maybe there's a microphone.
Hey, I just the first question and the response. What is the first person narrative according to you? When he talks when a person says something for his and her opinion. So
opinionated.
That's the response.
Okay, interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The first question, I think that the first person narrative to me is the first witnesses that saw the story first, and I think he's the most trusted person that we should talk to know about the story, because he's the one who first saw the action or whatever that we're gonna talk about. Thank you.
Thank you.
The first person narrative is when the journalist is presented in the content that he will produce. It can be a vlog while he shares an experience, and at the same time he delivers the message to the audience. And nowadays, this storytelling content is mostly available at YouTube, where the YouTubers share vlogs, and on TikTok also.
Okay, great. Does anyone have responses to something that is not the first question? Yes. Okay. Here, down there. Oh, there are multiple hands.
Hello. I believe we should be part of the storytelling as journalists, because we are humans and we are people that are affected and surrounded by the fact, or by the incident. So we have to be present, not by being biased or giving our opinion, but being there as part. In Lebanon, we have seen this. I believe this is how I understood the question. When the big fires were held up, we had a female journalist that she became the news. Her reaction of the fire, her crying on the live TV at 4 a.m. was unbelievable true, that she became the news and she actually pushed people to interact more with the fire. So I believe with her being part of the news, she actually helped the news of going up and up and up again.
Right. Okay.
What happened was unethical as a journalist. This thing happened is unethical because she shared her emotions online.
Why unethical? She's a human, she has feelings, she should share them.
As a journalist, she shouldn't share her emotion on
Great. Great discussion. And very important. Maybe a last comment, and then I would like to move on, even though I have tons of hands, but we'll have time for questions later. But let's hear last comment.
Concerning this incident, I was with the female journalist, and she told us that although this is unethical as a journalist to do, but she couldn't control her emotions, and it was a very emotional incident. She told us if you were in our shoes, you wouldn't even, you wouldn't help yourself from crying. So it was unethical as a journalist to show your emotions in public, but she couldn't see the people are suffering in this way. I was in her interview and she told us.
Okay.
She used it. No. She used it because it is a code that they should abide by. So when you do something in opposite, it is called unethical. But for her, it's being a human, as simple as that.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on, even though there are many hands, but I have a lot of stuff I want to say. And I want to just underline that this idea of using yourself as a character, becoming a human being and not only a journalist, it's not something that sort of one size fits all. It's not something that should be all of journalism. I think it has some part to play in some kinds of journalism, but I'm not saying that it's the only way to do journalism, or should be the only way, because I totally agree that there are problems, even ethical ones, that can be associated with this approach, but I do also believe that there are things to be gained from it. So it's a what do you call that in English? I'm not even sure. I know what it's called in Danish, but when something is neither good or nor bad, it has many aspects to it, and I'll dig into that now. But before doing that, I'm just gonna maybe just move this a little bit over here. I hope that's okay. Let me know if you can't hear me. Because I'm just going to provide some theoretical background before I go into the examples. And then we'll have time for questions, more discussion, and I'll also do the workshop to this afternoon, right, where we'll even elaborate further. So, this idea of using yourself as a character, showing emotion, showing opinion, letting the viewer feel that you are human, not only a reporter, invisible, some kind of mysterious figure, but actually there, present. This has to do with the notion of persona. I draw on theories from persona studies, especially David Marshall, an Australian theorist on persona, who's claiming that a persona is a decisive cultural trait of our time. That's due to, for instance, changing in the workforce, labor force, the rise of social media, where we all perform our personalities to some degree. We see changes in the workforce that seems to underline that people more so get hired to do different tasks and jobs, not because necessarily they are the best, but they are the best at convincing others that they are the best. So it's not necessarily only about talent anymore, maybe it never was, but now it's definitely also about displaying that talent, getting that out there. And I think that also is important in our media landscape right now. As journalism students, you'll probably know that there are not tons of jobs to have. Actually, the whole notion of getting a job is kind of old-fashioned, because people don't get jobs anymore. They get hired as freelancers or projects, temporary positions, etc., and move from here to there. It's very seldom that people just get hired by the BBC and then they stay there for the next 20 or 40 years. Oh, okay. Is it better now? Maybe I should just stay close. I just have a tendency to move because I like to move. No, but it's fine. I'll try this. It's okay. And secondly, I draw from Philip Auslander. He's an American scholar in performance studies, and he's underlining this understanding of persona as a constructed identity, meaning that the persona is very much context dependent. It's adopted to a specific performance. In our case, the persona of the journalist is adopted to fit the story at hand, fit the format, fit the genre, fit the media outlet maybe, but also fit the aim of the story. So is it supposed to be a funny story? Is it supposed to be emotional, tragic? What kind of things are you going for? That will also affect your persona, right? So the idea of a persona is that you're not being yourself 100% when you're applying yourself as a character in a narrative, in a piece of journalism. You're drawing on parts of yourself, selected parts of your personality, and that's what you're performing. You could even argue right now I'm performing the persona of a lecturer, of a professor. So I'm being in one way, I'm dressing in one way, I'm speaking in one way, I'm acting in one way, my body language is in one way, and maybe it would be different if I was with my friends or family or kids, or if I was with my tennis partner or whatever. So we're doing this all the time, right? We are defining or using versionized or different versions of ourselves due to the context. And that's very much this notion of persona that underlines that. As the end of the quote here says, it's a construct designed to allow the performer to work within specific aesthetic, genre, social and cultural frame and discourses. And we also know that from journalism, right? I mean, whether you're doing a piece of investigative journalism or you're doing a TikTok video or Snapchat journalism or Instagram story, that can also be investigative, but it can also be more humorous. Then you apply a different kind of journalist persona. You want that to fit your story, like you do with everything. Composition, the choice of sources, the choice of angle, light, editing, etc. All these different aspects of doing video journalism. The persona is just one more aspect, it's just one more tool that you can draw on. So why do I use performance theory? Well, I do that because performance theory is very useful when we're thinking of different actions that are partly something to do with staging, that there is something that enters a context where there's a need to do something, and this doing allows you to showcase yourself and use yourself in various ways. And it really also underlines that there is agency here. That, I mean, even though journalism is a trade and there are ways to do it, a piece of journalism changes if we change the journalist. So the journalist does have agency. The girl, the female reporter that you mentioned that was crying during these fires, she had one way of showcasing emotions. If you replaced her with another reporter that was maybe less emotional or emotional in a different way, then that would change the journalism. So the journalist has agency. And as Richard Schechner, US professor of performance studies, also underlines, there is this vibration between, in this kind of performance is a manner of not using yourself, but also not using yourself. So it kind of vibrates between this, not artificial construct, but some kind of construct, but a construct that is drawing on you as a human being. You can act to some extent, of course, but if you want to come through the screen as a trustworthy journalist, then you probably have to be yourself and put yourself out there to some degree. Carlson also underlines the idea of the repetitive in performance, that there's an ongoing process being created, things are being done and redone, and in that process an agent materializes. And I think that fits journalism really well, because journalism is very much about repetition. It's a very repetitive trade. We're doing the same things over and over again. We're researching, we're interviewing, we're storyboarding, we're shooting, we're editing, we're publishing, we're getting comments, and we're doing all things all over again. And the media has daily publication cycles, or weekly. We have a weekly podcast or a daily newspaper, and tomorrow we're doing it again. So it's very much about repetition, and through this repetition, there is the opportunity of the journalist becoming a persona, because a journalist becomes a persona specifically, or at least increasingly so, in the repetition of doing things in a certain manner. The female reporter in the fires you mentioned, well, maybe she becomes kind of, oh, that's the emotional reporter, and people hate her, or people love her. They take a stand towards her, and they become connected or disconnected to her, whether or not they subscribe to this kind of journalism. But by doing it again and again, she performs her persona as an emotional human journalist. Okay, now you might sit there and wonder, okay, what on earth does this have to do with media literacy? Why is this guy up there? Is it just a favor he's returning because Jad visited him last week? I don't think so. I think this idea of using yourself as a character has very much to do with media literacy. As Jad mentioned, I think, in the opening lecture, I think, all media messages are constructions. And he also said media simplifies reality. And I would say, when you think about what I just said about persona and performance, which is my two main theoretical concepts that I apply, the use of a journalist as a character is a construct as well, right? It's a partly made up identity to fit the context that it takes place in. And persona definitely, by doing so, simplifies reality as well. You select pieces of yourself that you emphasize, other pieces of yourself that you downplay or hide, because it's not suitable, it's not interesting for the viewer, doesn't do anything with the material journalism-wise. So you simplify yourself, you alter yourself, you versionize yourself, and by doing that you also versionize, simplify reality. But I think, and now I'm getting to the point about media literacy, doing persona-driven journalism, or being a character in your own pieces, the thing is that normally we can just, if we do traditional news reporting or traditional journalism where we're not characters, where the sources are the characters, they are the ones that speak, then we are this kind of mysterious, invisible force that's you can't see them, you can't feel them, you can't connect to them. It's just journalism materializes out of nowhere because someone turns on a camera or a voice recorder or writes words. And in the newspaper you might say, the Guardian spoke to this and that, or this man says this to the Guardian. So it becomes arbitrary. It becomes like, okay, this kind of unpersonal big media institution. So where's the journalist? By being a character, you put yourself out there, you become visible, but you also, by becoming visible, by being a persona, get to confront yourself and your ways of doing journalism. It becomes more evident. It becomes more clear both to you and the audience. It allows for maybe a higher degree of transparency, or it can do, if you let people know what you're doing right now, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, becomes part of the piece. And if that is the case, then it should allow for a higher degree of becoming self-critical as journalists. In media literacy, we talk a lot about becoming critical towards information and messages. Is it a lie? Is it true? Where does it come from? Who paid for that information? Is it fake news? Is it an infodemic, as Jad uses the word? But with the character and the persona coming into the play, we also start to become critical towards ourselves as journalists, as reporters, increasingly so. Oh, that's at least an ambition of mine, that it could be thought of in that way. So in that understanding, persona-driven journalism, the journalist as a character, has a lot to do with media literacy. Right, let's watch some journalism, some videos. I think I need to go out of my slide now, just to open the video. And I have different videos here that sort of showcases different approaches to applying yourself. And I'm going to present the typology in a few minutes, or quite a lot of minutes, because there's a lot of video. But I have chosen this first one, Taliban Land, which is a TV documentary. It's made by Danish television, aired on national TV. It's with a Danish-Afghan reporter called Najib Kaya, who reported from Afghanistan multiple times. And what I want you to sort of pay attention to is how he puts himself in the piece as a character. And then I will speak a little bit about that. Let's watch the first clip here. It's the opening minutes of the documentary.
Så er lige bordet flyet. Det er meget surrealistisk, fordi jeg er den eneste passager med det her fly her. Alle andre er på vej ud af Afghanistan, mens jeg er på vej hjem. Der er simpelthen ikke nogen mennesker, der er rejst til Afghanistan. Og lufthavnen er fyldt med mennesker, der er desperate for at komme ud. De kan ikke finde flybilletter, de kan ikke finde sæder, de kan komme med.
De er bange for Taliban, frygter for Talibans hævn, fordi de har samarbejdet med det vestlige militær eller andre udlandske institutioner.
Jeg har fået at vide, at Taliban de er inde i Kabul. Jeg har også hørt, der er sporadiske kampe, men der er også forlydende om, at de prøver at få en fredelig magtovertagelse.
Nu har de sagt over højtaleren, at de ikke kan lande i Kabul. Så flyet vender nu op og flyver tilbage til vej. Meget fuldstændig.
Det hele er gået virkelig hurtigt, siden Taliban begyndte at indtage Afghanistan. Så nu tyder alt på, at hovedstaden Kabul falder, måske inden for timer. For mig er det en meget vild oplevelse, det her. For jeg har dækket Afghanistan siden 2004. Der har været mit hjerteblod, journalistiske hjerteblod. Jeg er dansker af afghansk oprindelse og har fulgt konflikten. Skrevet bøger om det, lavet dokumentarfilm. Og den her begivenhed, det er simpelthen den største begivenhed, der er sket mens jeg har dækket konflikten.
Det piner mig, at jeg ikke kan være med til at rapportere fra Afghanistan her i de afgørende timer. Mange af mine journalistkolleger er til stede. Problemet er, at de af sikkerhedsmæssige årsager ikke forlader lufthavnsområdet, som stadig er kontrolleret af vestlige styrker. Derfor får verdenssamfundet meget lidt at vide om, hvad der reelt foregår ude i landet. Det er det, jeg vil råde bod på ved at rejse rundt i Talibans Afghanistan som den første udenlandske journalist. Hvis ellers jeg kan finde en måde at krydse grænsen på.
Imens mange afghanere forsøger at komme ud af landet, så forsøger du at komme ind. Prøv at fortælle os hvorfor.
Jeg synes, det er ekstremt vigtigt, at vi har nogle journalister derinde, som kan være øjne og ører, og som på en eller anden måde kan hjælpe med at stille Taliban til regnskab for nogle af de ting, som de måske ikke gør, eller måske ikke gør. Det finder vi ud af.
That was the opening scene, the first 3 minutes of this TV documentary. And I think what really strikes me here, as when we think about this character, journalist as a character, is of course the footage itself, that he's shooting a lot of it himself, front of camera, right? He's situating himself as the main protagonist of this documentary, but also underlining a narrative that has this sort of classic structure of a journey, and even underlining a drama of whether or not he gets into Afghanistan or whether or not he actually succeeds in getting to the places where the Taliban are, although all the other reporters don't. So if he can sort of become special, and if he can actually have his ambition fulfilled as a journalist, and he tries to also underline his own ethos as a journalist, being this having, of course, Afghan roots, but also having a lot of experience with reporting on the Taliban, and trying to sort of, I won't say promote himself, but at least situate himself as a character with special traits. So we have the persona of this knowledgeable Afghan reporter, Danish Afghan reporter, who's now gonna do something that no other reporter does. And that's one way to do the reporting self. But let's look. I want to showcase 2 more clips, and then I'll say something more. Because in the next clip we have Najib Kaya has entered Afghanistan and has met with different fractions, also Taliban warriors, etc. And then we have a clip now where he meets with a human rights activist or lawyer. And let me just showcase that. What I want you to think about here is how this approach of using yourself as a explicit character on screen can also be a way to actually allow for a layer of meta communication, or communication about journalism as a trade and a reflection on our trade to become a part of the piece. That's what happens here.
Jeg skal mødes med en aktivist, som har været ude og tale for kvindernes rettigheder her i Afghanistan. Hun bor vist i det her område. Jeg tror, det er det rigtige sted. Jeg ringer lige til hende.
While it feels as though the world has given up on Afghanistan and Afghan women, we have not.
Mahbouba Siraj er et af mine store forbilleder. Hun er internationalt anerkendt som en af de fremmeste fortalere for kvinders rettigheder i Afghanistan.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
Oh, you sorry.
I'm fine. Thank you.
At the demonstration toilet.
Selvom hun bor i Afghanistan og vil være et let mål, er hun frygtløs i sin kritik af Taliban-bevægelsen.
The women of Afghanistan became doctors and engineers. The women of Afghanistan studied. They went to the parliament. They took their part in the government. They cannot just say these people don't exist. There's 18 million of us. 18 million women. It's quite a lot of women. So you're going to disregard all 18 million and say they don't exist. They don't have rights. They shouldn't be a part of the society. I don't know. Is it possible, you think, for them to do something like that? But then maybe by killing everybody, beating everybody, like they want to beat the religion into us. If the Taliban don't live up to their promises, I don't think the Taliban can run this country, because then the world will stop giving them help. Yeah.
you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Native John. I'm glad I could do this.
Good luck. Really wish you best of luck. I'll try
Are you going to be
to.
around or are you going to leave Afghanistan?
I'm gonna leave on Sunday or Monday.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm one of those guys, just when I'm in it, solidaric, but then I just leave, and I feel so bad about it,
Yeah.
But
Yeah, get your films, do your reports, this is what you do. All right,
Yeah.
it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah.
Don't feel guilty.
Yeah, but it's impossible not to.
Yeah, I know. That's also impossible not.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Hvordan? Kæft, jeg har dårligt med det. Hver gang jeg rejser rundt i Afghanistan, eller når jeg har været i Syrien, så bliver jeg mindet om de privilegier, jeg har. Det røde bedefarvede pas, som jeg bare kan tage op og vise til grænsevagten og til grænsebetjente forskellige steder og så ud igen. Så uanset hvor solidarisk man er, og uanset hvor meget man på en eller anden måde prøver at støtte op om nogle ting, så er sådan nogen som mig nogen, der til sidst stikker af, tager hjem igen til vores fredelige hjem og ordnede forhold og lever et trygt og sikkert liv. Og sådan en som Mahbouba, hun har jo muligheden for at bo i USA, hun har dobbelt statsborgerskab, hun har et fantastisk setup hjemme i USA, hun kan leve et trygt liv, hun kan leve et godt liv, men hun vælger at blive her. Hun vælger at blive her og kæmpe for kvindernes rettigheder. Og det er bare så respektindgydende, at jeg har svært ved at finde ord for det. Virkelig respektindgydende. Kæft for øjeblik.
Okay, so what I find interesting here is that in a sort of more traditional report where the journalist would not be a character, we would also see this interview with a human rights activist, and it would be about the source. We will hear her story, her work, that's it. And we also get that part here, traditional, non-character driven work. But then the camera continues to record Kaya and his reflections on journalism. He's sort of being upset about this kind of drop-down journalism where you get to places, conflict, war zones, then you report and then you leave and go back to your nice life. So it becomes this meta layer of communication about journalism as part of the piece. It almost becomes like confessional in a way, that he confesses to the camera about feeling bad about that. Of course, that's also a way to showcase some emotions, some attitudes towards doing this kind of journalism. But interestingly, also, I think it's not only about him, right? Because it also adds to the image of the source. Because he also speaks about how she could do the same, that she could also leave, but chooses not to. So it's also a way to make the character of the source come to life, or add a layer to her. So to use yourself as a journalist character in a piece does not necessarily mean that all the focus is on you. Here it also resonates with the source and gives some extra to the source. The depiction of the source is also extended by the way Najib Kaya reflects about the trade of journalism.
Excuse me, someone would like to ask a question?
Sure, we can do a question, but I also want to save some questions at the end. But let's do one question. Sure, why not?
Hi. I don't think that the journalist in this video or the previous video that he tell us a story of Afghanistan and the situation of Afghanistan. I'm sorry, I cannot see this in the video. I think that he's telling us his story through this situation in Afghanistan and the human rights there. I can't see. I do not agree with you. It's okay that he tell us his story, but the aim of this video not to know what happened in Afghanistan. As I see it, I see a story of a foreign journalist not from the area have a special a special opportunity that he come to this area and do his report, so he can tell us his story. He is a hero. He's a solidarity. So he tell us that, not the opposite.
Yeah, but I would also say it's probably due to the fact that I only chose segments. If you see the video in its totality, you will definitely, depending on your background and the audience, of course, you will get knowledge about Afghanistan and the situation. So I think it's maybe partly because I've chosen small clips, small segments. It's a 80-minute documentary, so it's not doing the film justice. But yeah, but I understand that, and I agree that it is very much about him as a reporter and about journalism. It's not only about Afghanistan, but it is also about Afghanistan and the situation there. And then it's kind of, and that's maybe a special context, it's very much about the Western and especially the Danish army's actions in a specific area of Afghanistan. So it has this kind of specific resonance with the Danish audience and stirred quite a lot of debate. But that's sort of maybe a bit hard to see from these clips, of course. I want to showcase one final clip here from the film, and then I want to move on because I have a lot of. I know you have more questions, and I have time for questions at the end, and also I will be happy to discuss further in the lunch break and the rest of the day. So, but I really want to get through some more clips here. Here I'm just going to go. Here he's visiting a family who lost. Members of their family, and this is an example of what you also mentioned, this idea of the emotional journalist.
که در داخل از این مملو از مواد انتحاری است، مملو از پر از مواد انفجاره می بود، این باید که خانم فرو میریخت، دوام فرو میریخت و بعدشان بیخی تأخیر است.
که داعش هست، ایده کم تمرین که امریکایی بود. این کلش گپای ناق هستن، جای رسیدن به داعش گرفتن نمیتونه، خانه از ملکی رو میزنه به نام داعش گفته.
ایده داعش هست. خود بچه دیدو دانه در داعش هست طفلای معصوم
این خود انجینیر از برای این بچه که فامیل شما باجه مست
Naboerne til familien fortæller alle sammen, at det var børn og voksne fra den samme familie, og altså, der ikke er noget spor af sprængstoffer, og at det var et forkert mål, der blev ramt.
Familien og vennerne er selvfølgelig meget rystede. Det er virkelig tragisk. Det virker som om det var uskyldige mennesker. Det lavede det til, det indikerer det.
اسم ما ایمال احمدی است، برادر انجینر صاحب که دیروز به شهادت رسید برادر.
در وقت چی شما میفهمیدن در جریان چی بودن وقتی که حمله کردن سرش
وقتی از وظیفه می آمد، از وظیفه آمده بود دیدان دروازه وقتی که موتر میخواست گراج کنم، بعضی افرادان در داخل موتر شده بودن که اونجا تا داخل شاید چیز خود بشینن در داخل بیان بار کنن موتر. و در اون اثناء یاد سراغ داد که خیلی دلخراش بود. و یک ریپورت، یک راپور دیگر گرفته بودن که کاملا اشتباه بود. ان نفر به شمول خودش ما هستش داریم جلد ازش که یکی به شمول دختر خودم بود، تقریبا 2 ساله بود.
نامش چی بود؟
ملکت. و 3 تا از یک برادر که همینجا خودش اونجا استراحت بود، طفلک‌ها در بیرون بودن و داخل موتر بودن و یک تا میمان آمده و تو هم خور زده بود، دخترش بود تقریبا 2 ساله 2.5 ساله بود.
از عکس دخترک خودش رو پیش
من فعلا
عکسش پیش نیست تلفنی
من خودم یادم از همین تو تا برادر زادن کاریم در اینجا عکس شان هست در 28 ساله
I think I'll stop the clip here because I want to move along. So here, of course, a clear-cut example of this emotional reporting, the journalist displaying himself as a human being with feelings, emotions, a human being that becomes affected by what he's reporting on. And in a way, maybe you can, for some it might be manipulative, like by showcasing his own feelings, he's telling us what to feel. For other viewers, it may seem good or constructive that he's just human, like us, and maybe he's feeling on behalf of us. He becomes the connection between the viewer and the topic or the source, and by adding emotion or allowing himself to become emotional and display emotion, he strengthened that link. He potentially strengthened that link between the source and the viewer. So this is an example of the reporting self, where you draw on yourself, perhaps your own expectations, your plans, your dreams, prejudices, whatever you have, knowledge, like Kajib mentioned in the early clip, toward the topic you're reporting on. Then you position yourself on behalf of the reader, or the viewer, and then you also position yourself in relation to the material, in different positions. It can be an effective position, as we had with the emotional elements, or it can be a more professional position, satirical, humorous, constructive, etc. It depends on the material and also on what you want to do with your story. That's the reporting self. I want to showcase very briefly an example of what I call the participatory self. I'm just going to show the first 30 seconds or so. It's a 25-minute YouTube documentary made by Al Jazeera. It's about stray dogs of Cairo, Egypt, and about a group of people that sort of has an ambition to save stray dogs. What is interesting here is that the journalist becomes part of the group that tries to save these dogs. So in his reporting, he tries to join the group in order to get more knowledge about the phenomenon that he's reporting on. Let me just show you the opening, and please also pay attention to how the voiceover, by using the first person form, it also becomes a way to underline that the journalist is present in the, not necessarily on-screen presence. It doesn't have to be on-screen, it can also be off-screen, but here by using the first person form, he underlines that this is his story. He has something he wants to share, and he has a commitment to do so.
Cairo, a city of 20 million people, but also more than 2 million stray dogs. The animals and the people of Cairo live side by side, but not always in perfect harmony. I'm an Egyptian filmmaker. My friends call me Soli. And I've often wondered what life is really like for these unwanted animals. This curiosity took me on an unexpected and unplanned journey, meeting people and visiting places I never imagined possible. But the story starts here, at home in Cairo.
Yeah, so the first person form, that he's involved and that he's now throughout the story meeting persons and places that he didn't think was possible. But that's one element. The other element is that he actually starts to participate in the action of these saving stray dogs groups. And that's an example of what I call the participatory self. So when the journalist not only reports on topics, but also participates in the topic that he's working on. It's where you actually enter a connection with the material and the topic you're working on. You become directly involved. You become more directly involved than the first-person reporter as Najib Kaya. Even though he was emotionally engaged, etc., he wasn't trying on his own body, where, for instance, the life of a refugee or the life of a soldier or the life of a human rights activist. Here the journalist tries, to some extent, the life of a stray dog activist. So you use curiosity, you perhaps also use the feeling of being an outsider. This resonates with the idea of doing ethnographic journalism, where you also use the method of participant observation. So you sort of balance yourself as a journalist between observing the reality, the phenomenon that you report on, but also participating in the actions, the doings, the lives, the habits, the rituals of the groups that you report on. So you sort of alternate between observing and participating. And through that process, you ideally become more knowledgeable about the topic. You might also become more biased. You might start to fall in love or feel more commitment to the group that you're reporting on, which can of course be a problem, at least in some definitions of journalism. But in other definitions of journalism, it's not a problem. It's a way to communicate understanding and knowledge, and not necessarily about balancing fair news reporting, objective news, etc. There are many kinds of journalism out there, and the participatory self will be a way to hopefully communicate a more in-depth understanding of other people's lives. Okay, I'm gonna move on now to something that I'm kind of not happy with this category, the playful self. I think the playful is a bad word because it's not something that's supposed to be a game. But here I'm looking at examples where the form itself, the technique, the aesthetics, the way it's shot underlines the first person. So in the other, you saw some of that in the other stuff as well, but here it's very evident. And this is especially the cases for journalism on Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram stories. We've all gotten used to the mobile phone and how we shoot with it, right? And it becomes like an extension of our arm. So the way we shoot ourselves and reality becomes like directly confrontational or directly towards the object. It's not like we put our mobile phone over here and then we stand here and talk to the source, unless we do like mojo journalism, sort of pretending to be TV journalists with a mobile phone. No, we often just confront directly with the material. And I have two short examples. I'm just going to show the opening of this thing called First Person. It's a Snapchat account which sort of has news and feature stories from around the world. Just consider how the format and the genre here, as remember Auslander and his constructed persona, and how the genre and the aesthetics and the form also dictates what you can do or should do. And this is also the case here in the Snapchat reporting here.
This 17-year-old collects used hair from the dumps and sells it.
And this is the recycled hair? Yes. Wow.
Sorry, I can see it on my screen. Sorry. You need the image as well. Thanks.
This 17-year-old collects used hair from the dumps and sells it.
And this is the recycled hair?
Yes.
Wow.
I can find some weaves in the dumps, in the sewage. Some are made up of plastic, which affect some animals. After 3 weeks, women in Kenya remove their weaves and throw them away.
This entire dump site looks like it's made out of plastic bags and hair.
Some wigs are made of human heads, but they're expensive, so...
Okay, I'm going to stop this, and then I'm going to show the other example, and then we'll just talk about it. This is from Hind Hassan, who's doing a lot of reporting for Vice Media on Instagram.
Look, this is all journalists here. These are all journalists, and we're basically stuck because Ayman, are they special forces? Israeli Special Forces, huh?
Yes, Sam.
They're here. Look, they're coming towards us.
I don't know.
Journalists, like this is all.
Okay, I'm gonna stop and go to here. So, two examples of this kind of playful self is a bad word, but what I really try to emphasize is that it's very much in the form, the technique of the platform that sort of dictates or helps their first person narrative be brought along here. In the first example, of course, it's kind of humorous, tempo, upbeat, kind of nice feeling where they look into this girl's business of creating hair out of garbage or leftover hair. And you see almost like the camera becoming an extension of the body of the journalist, right? You have the handshake where it sort of feels like we're almost at point of view with the material. And then you have Hind Hassan's reporting where she could have chosen to shoot the group of journalists and their experience, but when it becomes her first point of view, it becomes her experience as a journalist. She also yells in the voiceover, we're journalists, so she also underlines that she's one of them, and maybe the most, I don't know if she's the most important one, but because she's shooting like she does, and saying the things she does, she underlines her presence at scene, even though she's with another group of reporters. It could have been a news report about the lives of these journalists, but it becomes increasingly, or maybe mostly so, a report on Hind Hassan's life as a journalist facing these Israeli special forces. So I think that's an interesting way to approach that as well. And it's not, again, I'm not sort of claiming whether that's good or bad. That's just a choice in terms of composition, in terms of platform use, whether or not you face the camera toward a piece of a part of reality that doesn't include you, or a part of reality that very much includes you. And here she definitely does something that includes her. I have a few more examples, but I think I'm not gonna have time to show them because I want to be able to wrap up some other stuff as well, and I want to maybe also have time for questions. But I just want to let you know, I can share these examples for you if you're interested. My Uncle Tudor is a Moldovan TV documentary, Ukraine-Russian Moldovan documentary, which is very much more personal. Now we're talking about the journalist as a character who's very intimate, who's sharing life details, who's actually sharing her own personal experience with sexual abuse. And in the journalism, she confronts the man who abused her 20 years ago, and she does that at a family reunion. So it's very much an intense material where the journalist puts herself out there and becomes the main protagonist by sharing life details. So we have seen emotional journalists, we've seen participant journalists, we've seen journalists that use the first person point of view with Instagram, etc. And now this is an example of the personal self where the journalist becomes intimate, confessional, very much drawing on her own experience and attitudes to an extent that almost feels, I don't know, too much, I'm not sure, but for some viewers it would definitely feel as too much. Then there's a final type of self that I just want to draw your attention to, and I'm not sure this example is the best one, but it's an example that you might know. It's a Palestinian filmmaker that made this some years ago called 5 Broken Cameras, and it's basically about how his cameras are continuously trashed by Israelis because he's trying to cover the Gaza conflicts. And he's doing that by involving himself on an activist level. So he has not only personally involved in the material, not only participating in the material, he becomes the material, and he becomes the material with a clear-cut ambition of intervening, of creating change, of being activist. So an activist self is also a way in. And then you might say, well, journalism is not about activism, that's two different worlds. But as I said, I'm into research on the border territories of journalism. And I do find more and more journalism to also have an activist element to it. A lot of the climate change reporting in my home country has activist ideals and tries to make changes, behavioral changes with their readerships or their audiences. So there's an activist element to that. And the activist, of course, again, uses the person as a main character, but it's this sort of clear-cut interventionist goal that is very much a character trait of the activist self. So this is what I want to present as a typology for the different kinds of selves that you can think of, both in terms of when you, as media literacy folks, think of pieces of journalism, but also as practicing journalist, what kind of self could I apply to my journalism? What is suitable to the material or suitable to the story that I want to do? Should I participate in the action? Should I become part of the group? Do I have a personal experience that I can share? Does that add something to the story? Should I do that? Or should I just be a reporting self that might be on screen and might show emotion, but doesn't have any sort of personal connection or activism involved in the material? These are different layers or variants of the self. I also want to, here at the end, just this is very drafty. I just actually came up with this a few days ago, but I hope it's useful for you. It's something that you can think about when you're in your research process. So the early stages of your story. For instance, I'm not sure about the stories you're going to pitch to me this afternoon. Let's see about that. But when you do your research, when you do your storyboarding, and when you start thinking about, okay, this might be a story where it's suitable that I use myself. So you can consider these 4 different layers or concepts. The idea of temporality. So think about what kind of development should the journalist character go through? What is the self-narrative? This, of course, resonates with the whole idea of plot, structure, narrative. Then you have the concept of spatiality. You consider and research on what kind of spaces that the journalist will occupy, and what kind of actions will be carried out on those spaces. What will the journalist do as a character? And always in relation to the story, of course, always in relation to the aim of the story and the audience. It's not just because, I think it could be fun to try to save stray dogs. No, and of course it has to have a goal, it has to have a meaning, a purpose in your story. Thirdly, you can think of the relation interaction, a spectrum. So how will the journalist character interact and relate to other sources in the piece? For instance, you saw Kaya, when he interacts with the human rights advocate, that he also puts himself and his own sort of reluctance to do journalism this way out there. That's an interaction or a relation that becomes clear. And finally, you can consider different types of aesthetics and form, how what kind of mood, what kind of style would the piece have? Should it be shot as a first person? I mean, now camera-wise, composition-wise, does that add to the piece? Should it be with you on-screen character, or could you be an off-screen character? Actually, the Moldovan, that I didn't show example of, the personal documentary, has mostly the character as off-screen. Even though it's so intimate, so confessional, so private, it's actually an off-screen journalist character. Right, and now, wrapping up, something to consider, because maybe you will sit here and think, maybe you sit there and think, okay, I want to try and use myself, or you're thinking, I definitely don't want to do that. That's not journalism, which is totally fine. If you start thinking about it, and if you sort of say, that might be something, then I think you should always think of these questions like, why should I apply myself? Why do I feel like using myself? Is it just because I like to be on camera and become famous? Or does it actually add to the journalism? Does it provide any journalistic value to your story? And then, secondly, if you sort of landed on, yes, it does add value, then think about what kind of first-person approach is beneficial. What kind of self should I put in my piece? What is it that the material needs, maybe more than what I would like to do? And then you have to remember to be critical towards yourself. I talked about this idea of self-critical awareness in terms of media literacy when we think about the journalist as a character. And I think when doing this type of journalism, it's very important that you are self-critical and that you try to do the stuff that you do to sources. You have to do that to yourself as well. So you have to try and verify information. Do I remember this correctly? Why am I behaving the way I do now? Why am I feeling this? Why am I thinking that? Why am I saying this on screen or off screen? So be critical towards yourself as well. And then bear in mind that, yeah, it can have many side effects. Once you put yourself out there, you might get ridiculed, you might become famous, you might become a problem child of journalism. Like with the lady who reported on the fires, it's my impression that it's not for anyone, that people disagree to some extent with her work. And that's something that happens once you put yourself out there. But things that can be gained by using yourself, I think, is some of this. It's often something that can create connections with the viewer, intimate connections. It can add trustworthiness and confidentiality, that you showcase yourself as a human being. It can maybe also add transparency in terms of what kind of method you do. When you have the Stray Dog documentary, it's kind of investigative, but it's also showcasing how the investigation is done because the journalist is a character. So it becomes transparent in its investigation. Of course, there's something about humanness, empathy, ambiguity that is also increasingly out there by providing yourself as a character. And of course, there is a narrative structural element to it. It's an extra thing that you can play with alongside camera work, light, editing, etc. You have an extra element to play with. Things that can be lost, well, definitely there's something about authority and objectivity. If we're thinking about authority as this old school journalist kind of thing where you have authority because you leave yourself out of the story, you're just reporting, you're not biased, you are reporting fair and balanced about the topic, well, then that can be a problem. But maybe you can also consider different kinds of authorities, and maybe there's a new or a second kind of authority to be gained by putting yourself in the piece that is not the original journalism authority, but a different one. Of course, there's a risk that it can become self-loving, that you do this because you just love yourself on camera, and then you become about you and nothing else, and that's not good for journalism. And of course, there's also the risk of losing the critical aspects, because it's just easy to use yourself as a source, right? Because you're right there, you know yourself, so you might as well use you, but then the critical aspect becomes lost. That's actually the last bit, so, and now I see something about the time is bad, but please feel free to ask me anything now or in the break here, and also really feel free to reach out through these communication forms or channels. Do we have time for questions? I know time is up, but during lunch? I have a lunch and a workshop, yeah, so there'll be plenty of opportunities there, and please reach out. I'm very approachable. Thank you so much.